Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be talking about intelligence, counterintelligence, spying, and a variety of other interesting topics. My guest today is an expert on all of these topics. William Bill Costanza retired from the Central Intelligence Agency as a senior operations officer after 25 years of service. He served as assistant professor in the Department of Forensic and Legal Psychology at Marymount University from 2012 to 2017, where he created the Intelligence Studies concentration in their master's program. He was also associate adjunct professor at Georgetown University in their Security Studies program, where he created the course Treason, Terrorism and Betrayal, on which his recent book is based. Bill Costanza, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you being with me today. You've really got a very interesting book, Treason, Terrorism, and Betrayal. You cover the waterfront on this. There's nothing left. Why did you decide to write it, and what was the main theme of the book?
Well, this is a book that really had its origin in the class that I taught at Georgetown University. You basically drawing on my background, working in intelligence for 25 years, and marrying that with my academic training in social science allowed me to look at some questions that interested me, and particularly um, what cause individuals to become threats to U.S. national security. And so, after creating and teaching this course for about 4 years, and interacting with students and having it refined and getting the feedback, I was able to put all those ideas together in a book.
And I would imagine that since time immemorial, going back to cave dwellers or whatever, that you've probably always had people who were involved in some type of spying or treason or whatever the case may be. We've heard the famous stories of, oh golly, the I'm trying to think of the ones. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were spies in this country. We have, of course, going back to the Revolution, Benedict Arnold, and we've had many others in between. What do these individuals, are there any characteristics as to why they cross the line, or what are some of the motivating factors to make people get involved in this?
Well, that the book looks at that as it's a complicated question, and the book tries to um, look at how do we understand individuals. How do we look at their human behavior? We're sort of conditioned to live in a Newtonian universe where we're always looking for cause and effect. What are the root causes of certain behaviors? And my book looks at basically, let's not focus on root causes, because human beings are much more complex than that. They have a projection through life. What are the things that will have a person become susceptible to crossing that line? And so the book, offers different methodologies of how to explore and answer that question.
Mhm. How do people in the government or other folks, how do they identify these threats to the U.S. security?
There's a vetting process that occurs. For example, in the book, I look at three categories of threats within the context of threats to the U.S. government in terms of individuals, adversaries working against the U.S. government, whether they're in intelligence services, whether adversaries try to penetrate other parts of the government. Um, there's vetting processes that allow an individual to be cleared to be able to get access to classified information. and there's polygraphs and there's background investigations. And so when the government gives you privileged access, they've determined that you're a loyal person who could be allowed access to this information. Of course, the adversaries are trying to find those individuals that will violate their clearance and provide that information to them.
They certainly are. When you were talking about that, that reminds me of well, we talk about people, lower level people in the U.S. government, maybe not so low level now that I think about it. But when you were talking about that classification, I'm reminded of the situation with our current President Donald Trump, who had boxes of secret plans or whatever in Mar-a-Lago piled up in bathrooms and warehouse rooms and what have you. Uh, how do you deal with something like that? How that seems a little worrisome. We never had a trial on it, but it
Well,
still existed.
yeah, that is problematical, and the thing about classified information is that once you go through the clearance process, you're legally bound to protect that information. You sign an NDA, and that's in perpetuity for the rest of your life. And there's lots of cases where people have gone to jail for releasing classified information, 1 or 2 pages, and they've been, spent years in jail because it can pose a grave threat to U.S. national security. Um, Now, in the case of the boxes at Mar-a-Lago, that's a whole different category, and it's controversial where that never went to court. So, there was a process where they would have had to determine, the threat, and they would have talked about whether the president had the authority to do that. So that's never been adjudicated. But if you or I took 34 boxes of classified information, we'd be probably sitting in, Florence at the Supermax in Colorado for a very, very long time because it's very serious about classified information and controlling that because of the huge impact that it could have. I mean, look at the case of Snowden, who took all that information, led to the U.S. government spending billions of dollars to try to recoup the loss in intelligence.
Exactly. And of course, well, you talk about that case with the judge, I think it was Judge Cannon, as I recall, and she, on a technicality, she ruled it, I believe, I may be wrong on this, Jack Smith did not have there was no legal precedent for making him a special prosecutor or whatever it was. And of course, Donald Trump uh, stonewalled the whole thing with having one lawsuit after another. So it never got to court, but it certainly is one that probably should have gotten to court and may at some point in time. I don't know. I think that they could still go back and revisit that. We're talking about upper level spies and people who give information out. And I know that every country, I would guess, spies on other countries, be it your friends or your foes. The Israelis spy on us, we spy on them, the Chinese, the Russians, what have you. But another person that has been really getting the spotlight is Tulsi Gabbard, who heads up the National Intelligence Operation. She's the director of National Intelligence, and so much of the information allegedly that has been reported that she has gotten right into the Kremlin. Do you have an update on that? Have you heard anything one way or the other? Maybe that's another one that should be investigated.
No, I mean, these sorts of things, are looked at by counterintelligence authorities in the U.S. government, and obviously all that's going to be classified and secret. But in general, that's the job of counterintelligence is to identify these possible threats in that these adversaries pose. And you look, for example, on the Chinese who use cyber and agents to steal economic information as well as military information. North Koreans. There's enough adversaries out there who really want to know exactly what's going on in the U.S. government. Even on the health side, there's a lot of interest in how we, manufactured the vaccines that helped in COVID. These are all secrets requirements that adversaries, are interested in stealing from us essentially. So the counterintelligence folks are there to try to prevent that from happening. That's through vetting and getting the right people. Allowing the right people to have privileged access to the classified information so they could do their work in protecting the country.
And you're absolutely right. If you or I had taken one page, I remember the case with, I think, Sandy Berger, who pilfered one or two pages out of somewhere and took it home with him, and he was in deep trouble for doing that. So there's no doubt about it that it's a very serious situation, and we cannot be too careful. Well, we're going to come back and talk about that in just a moment. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station or an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer and you like our shows, you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're talking with an expert on a variety of topics and his new book called Treason, Terrorism, and Betrayal. And my guest is William Bill Costanza, who retired from the Central Intelligence Agency as a senior operations officer after 25 years of service. Bill, let's touch on, we're talking about treason. Let's talk about the terrorism part. What did you have in mind when you were focusing on the terrorism part? I can see where they're very interrelated, they go hand in hand probably, but what exactly were you thinking when that particular topic came up?
Well, when I looked at organizing the book in terms of national security threats, having treason, terrorism, and betrayal, meaning the unauthorized release of classified information to individuals that shouldn't have it. The underlying factor was everything is based on human behavior. So looking at what elements of human behavior lead a person down this pathway to, do something that becomes a threat, whether it's treason, whether it's terrorism. We all end up in a place in life. We're not born with ideologies. We're not born with grievances. Something happens along the way that leads us down this pathway. So using an interdisciplinary approach, looking at all these different disciplines, psychology, anthropology, narratology, all these different ways of looking at human behavior, that's sort of like the unifying factor to understand why an individual um, does what they do in terms of becoming a threat. In the case of terrorism, I looked at case studies to try to recreate and do behavioral assessments of different types of individuals to see if there were some underlying factors. And there's a way of doing it from a social science standpoint. And so uh, that's how I sort of approached it. So even though it seems different, we're all driven by the same sorts of behavioral drives.
Mhm. I'm sure you ran into so many interesting stories and characters and situations, many expected, perhaps some unexpected. What were one or two of the ones that really stay with you and have the most salient message to you and to the public and the people who read your book?
Well, the case studies I use in the book, one was Zacarias Moussaoui, who was an Al Qaeda operative. He was a Moroccan, born in France, and had siblings, had a very difficult childhood. And in France at the time, being an immigrant, there was a lot of discrimination, a lot of problems in the family. They were in and out of orphanages, lots of different factors. But even so, when he was young, he even admired Martin Luther King because of the way that Martin Luther King was fighting for social justice for blacks in America at the time. But a number of things happened in his life: frustrations, discrimination, broken relationships. He was sort of at the end of his rope, so to speak, and he became very vulnerable to messages um, of, um, of very um, extremist interpretations of Islam, and eventually became involved in a network that essentially recruited him. He became susceptible and became recruited. But his brother, who grew up in the same environment, that didn't happen to him. He became a teacher. So what's the difference between the two? And that's why you have to really go into their environment and see their lived experience. It doesn't matter what I think. I'm trying to understand how they see the world and how they made decisions based on what they were confronted with in his life. So he moved into more of an extremist, world as when his brother didn't.
Mhm.
So,
I
uh,
can see that. Yes, please.
so that's the important factor, is really getting down into their lives and seeing, because we're all people, that we're all affected by certain things, traumatic things that happen in our life. How does that affect us, and how do we respond to that? He didn't have really much of a support network. When somebody comes by and gives you a philosophy and a social structure and begins to value you, you're going to gravitate towards that social structure. And that's what he did. It was extremist, not something we would do, but that's how it worked for him.
Mhm.
The other two cases, I look at Nidal Hassan, who did the attack at Fort Hood in Texas. Um, he was like an American jihadi. And then I looked at Timothy McVeigh, who was sort of an anti-government terrorist, and looked at his life to see what was his pathway, and what makes a person essentially cross the line to commit a terrorist act.
Mhm. Did you talk about the case studies that you studied, and your book is really well documented. It's packed full of great information, and it's really an outstanding book. Did you meet any of these people personally by any chance? Did you have a chance to talk to any of them, or was this information you gleaned from studies, from videos, from whatever, or maybe talking to their colleagues?
The most of the case studies, I didn't meet them directly. One that I did meet, but this was before um, I knew um, he was going to be arrested. That was Aldrich Ames. I'd met him in the course, briefly in the course of, my work. Um, the other person, there was Anna Montes, who was worked for DIA, and was a penetration of DIA by the Cubans. Um, I had extensive conversations with the FBI case handler of that case, who talked about it quite a bit. So in addition to just general research, I was able to get some, independent input from individuals that were directly connected to the case.
Mhm. As I recall, you mentioned Anna Montes. That was really a famous case, and she was a spy for decades, I believe. And they did a thing on her, a blurb on her on 60 Minutes a couple of years ago, but that was certainly a very interesting case, to put it mildly. But well, we're down to about our last 2 minutes. There's so much in your book that we did not talk about
All
today.
right.
What information would you like to share with our viewers about a couple of the items briefly that we did not get to that would be of interest to them?
I think that, the threats to U.S. national security are persistent, and will probably continue to expand as we move into a more contentious world, which means we have to be more vigilant in trying to identify these threats. Um, for example, statistically, there's still probably penetrations of the U.S. government, and so having to identify those to help us mitigate the threat. The government is trying to upgrade their vetting process, so I think that needs to continue with even more effort and vigilance as we move into the next phase of trying to maintain stability in the world and protect U.S. Values.
hmm Do you have any suggestions or recommendations for the policymakers in Washington as to what they might want to think about doing to improve their detection techniques and that type of thing?
I think the suggestion that I have is basically there has to be a bipartisan agreement to really maintain the vigilance to push through the reforms that have been starting to be implemented. They have what's called the Workforce 2.0, Trusted Workforce 2.0, and to make sure that continues to go and not become involved in sort of political wrangling, because it's critical. Most of the people who've been working that field, they work from all administrations for many years. Or it's basically they're not political, but they're trusted, and they have to be valued. And I think that's the message to them is, stay the course, continue to do what you promised to do.
That is so critical too, because for decades, I guess since the Jackson administration, when we went from the spoils system to the merit-based system in this country, that the majority of the employees that worked at the federal level were hired on merit. It didn't matter if you were Democrat, Republican, Federalist, Whig, whatever it might be, but you were hired because of your competency and you were loyal to the Constitution. You weren't loyal to some party or some individual. And that is so critical that we've got to get back into that if we're going to be able to have a united front against people who really want to do this country harm. There's no other way to put it. They really do in many ways, shapes, and forms. So, but Bill Costanza, you've done a great public service by writing this book. And I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Bill. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.